growing number of Chinese young people are struggling with an addiction to narcotics. Narcotics that Chinese companies are producing with the help of state subsidies. Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. Last month was Drug Abuse Awareness Month in China. I wasn't aware the CCP actually had things like awareness months, except for National Nothing Happened in Tiananmen Square Month, which is every month. Nationally, this was celebrated with the announcement that China's procuratorial organs had arrested 61,000 drug offenders over a recent period of 18 months. It's nice to see a Chinese headline about an organ without the word harvested in it. Locally, the central Chinese city of Jingzhou marked the month by staging a public incineration of 22 boxes containing seized meth, ecstasy, and ketamine. And what a fun ceremony it was for everyone downwind of that smoke. Now, Beijing's drug policies are notoriously harsh, with intense crackdowns and penalties like execution for drug traffickers, even if they're foreign citizens. According to China's top court, this tough strategy has been so successful that drug-related crime cases have been dropping for 8 years in a row. Ironically, you'd have to actually be high to believe any of China's official stats. More on that in a minute. But the Chinese government's zero tolerance towards narcotics at home takes quite a dramatic turn when it comes to supplying narcotics abroad. A recent report by the U.S. Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party from earlier this year details how the Chinese government provides subsidies to companies openly trafficking illicit synthetic drugs, as long as they are only selling them outside China. The Chinese synthetic drug business has been described by experts as being run with a level of professionalism and a corporate element that is unmatched anywhere else in the world. And according to Europol, it has made China the world's biggest manufacturer and distributor of synthetic lab-made drugs, such as synthetic cannabinoids and precursors for things like MDMA and fentanyl. And this is dangerous too, because think of how poor the quality of most products made in China are. Now imagine seeing this and thinking, I'm going to put that in my body. Now, this is in spite of the fact that Chinese leader Xi Jinping and U.S. President Joe Biden reached an agreement at the end of last year for Beijing to crack down on its export of substances used in the production of fentanyl, which is surprising since they've totally honored every other agreement they've made, like lowering their carbon emissions. I guess drugs aren't the only harmful thing China's helping to burn. But fentanyl isn't the only opioid flowing out of China into the veins of the West. Allow me to introduce nitazines, a synthetic opioid considered up to 50 times more potent than even fentanyl. Just remember when you start hearing about the nitazine epidemic that you heard it here first. Since nitazines are so potent, they can be moved in small quantities in all sorts of vessels, from large shipping containers to small parcel posts. Some of it has even been smuggled in dog food packaging. I always knew the Communist Party was run by cats. The volume in the packaging often depends on the customer, as Chinese synthetics are sold to large-scale buyers as well as to individual consumers from across the globe. It's like Postmates, but where you can order something consumed that will eventually kill you. So basically another Postmates. No matter what they're peddling, the drug trade in China is widespread and lucrative, with drug dealers all over the world able to get the goods online directly from the manufacturer at low prices. It's like an Amazon, where you can buy a bunch of shady items built in China. So basically just another Amazon. It's also good for the Chinese economy, at least in terms of employment. In fact, some people in China are employed in the drug trade without even knowing it. Take Sammy. After she graduated university with a degree in English, she went to work for a chemical company as a sales representative in the northeastern city of Shijiazhuang. By the time she realized that the chemicals the company was selling were actually narcotics, she had become dependent on the money her job was bringing in. She told the BBC that, at the start, we don't know what we're selling, but when we find out, we've fallen in love with the work. So, she's saying her work is addictive? I guess that tracks. Sammy is just one of what international law enforcement agencies estimate could be thousands of sales representatives working for illicit Chinese pharmaceutical and chemical companies producing and smuggling illegal laboratory-made drugs. Another Chinese narcotics salesperson told the BBC that the industry is easy and can provide higher wages, which attracts a lot of young people. Apparently, the only way to get the Chinese youth to stop laying flat is to offer higher wages to sell drugs that'll make foreigners lie flat forever. So the Chinese authorities are basically overseeing Chinese companies getting very wealthy from a flood of synthetic drugs. But while the party says it's doing a great job keeping those drugs away from Chinese young people, the story doesn't really hold. Even state-run media like the Global Times has recently admitted that the exact same synthetic drugs that China is manufacturing in bulk are spreading faster in China, especially affecting the younger demographic. And if the Global Times feels compelled to address this, then it must be bad. It was even stated that the proportion of minors among newly discovered drug abusers can no longer be ignored, with the drug problem posing substantial potential harm to individuals, families, and society at large. Which is saying something, because ignoring their problems is kind of China's whole thing. Which reminds me, happy nothing happened in Tiananmen Square month. At the same time, there's also been a reported rebound in domestic drug-related crimes, contrary to the drop in drug crime narrative being pushed by others. In response, the authorities have reportedly sent more than 2 million Chinese people to drug rehabilitation centers. And if those centers are even remotely similar to the detention centers in the Uyghur region of Xinjiang, where the authorities have sent more than 1 million Muslims, then I think I personally would need access to stronger opioids to just recover from my time in rehab. But with synthetic drugs becoming big business in China, it's hardly surprising that Chinese young people are getting hooked, no matter how hard China cracks down. I mean, with all these drugs being made in the country, what did they think was going to happen? You would think that the Chinese government would have learned something from its own history. Then again, it's hard to learn from history in China when history is so heavily censored. Oh, hello, consequences to your actions. 200 years ago, China suffered heavily under the success of another rising drug trade. Back then, the roles were reversed, though, with the Western powers at the time profiting off drugs flooding the Chinese market, while the Qing dynasty that ruled China at the time was trying to combat it. Opium was the sought-after drug back then, and strong Chinese demand for it was ruining China both financially and socially. So Chinese authorities tried to ban opium, but the Western powers were not willing to see their profitable opium trade to China come to an end. Instead, over the course of 2 wars in the 19th century, Britain and France soundly defeated the Qing dynasty, forcing them to leave the gates of China open to the opium trade. This also ushered in the period known in China today as the Century of Humiliation, a time when China fell under the influence of foreign powers and even had to cede territory to several of them. Some say that Chinese leader Xi Jinping is fixated on ending China's Century of Humiliation, or even getting revenge against the West for what the West once did to China. Maybe. Or maybe the Chinese government genuinely believed that China could profit off the narcotics trade, while the usual heavy-handed tactics at home could prevent the same drugs from devastating Chinese society. Certainly the havoc wreaked by the opium trade in the 19th century has had a lasting effect on the Chinese psyche. During the Chinese authorities' crackdown on online gaming back in 2021, gaming was referred to as spiritual opium, for example. Ironically, spiritual opium sounds like a dope power-up you'd get in an online game. But with drug abuse among young Chinese people now clearly a growing problem, China's going to have to start taking a long, hard look in the mirror. It seems that the Chinese authorities are going to need to do what they do best: launch a crackdown. This time, directed at the country's booming narcotics industry. If they don't, then everyone looks set to lose, from former Western powers to the new Qing emperor. And if he thinks he can just keep doing what he's been doing with no consequences, he must be getting high on his own supply. China Uncensored wouldn't exist without the support of fans like you over on patreon.com/China Uncensored. If you support the show, you'll get a bunch of cool perks, including the chance to ask me questions I'll answer on the show. And today's comes from Wavy Cup. Hey Chris, keep up the great content. Thanks. Question: if you were a member of Congress, what would be the first bill you would introduce, and would you ever consider a run at public office? Well, Wavy Cup, you know, I was actually talking with some people recently about how China Uncensored could actually get some legislation in front of Congress. No joke. I would like to see some more work on researching and understanding and ultimately combating China's unrestricted warfare. As for your last question, I do plan to run. Run from office. Thanks for your question and your support, Wavy Cup. And if you're interested in spiritual opium, I also have another video I'd like you to watch. This one. It's from my newest channel, Gamers Unbeaten, where I hide controversial topics in short videos on video games featuring politics, philosophy, and my patented sense of humor. This one is about the lure of charismatic leaders in Dragon's Dogma 2. Those like Mao Zedong created powerful cults of personality that killed millions. How'd they do it? Find out by checking out the episode. And click that orange button to support the show on Patreon. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching China Uncensored.